On the Brown Act may be newer to you, is that? Yes. Okay, perfect. So the Brown Act is a state law. It's found in the government code, and it requires transparency in our meetings. And what that means is we have to have an agenda, so you have an agenda for your meeting. It has to be, every item you're going to talk about needs to be noticed with a description. Here we had a description. It originally said training on Brown Act regulations, but because we broadened the discussion points, I asked for it to be amended to include due process requirements and nexus related to conditions. It has the time and place of the meeting. It has the ability for the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda but are germane to your commission, and then obviously anyone can comment on items that are on the agenda. The meeting agenda notices need to be published 72 hours in advance if your meeting is a regular meeting. So your standard meetings that occur on your standard day and time require the agenda notice to be provided 72 hours in advance. This is a special meeting. It's not your traditional time, so it only requires 24 hours notice. And the Brown Act applies to local agencies, so in this case it applies to the city. It applies to legislative bodies such as yourself as commissioners and commissions, and it applies to the city council. And then the interesting tidbit, it also applies to council members who have been elected to office but have not been sworn in. So when Vice Mayor Kendall and Council Member Geringer were elected back in November but they weren't sworn into office until December, it applied to them. So that's usually a new tidbit for people. So for those of you who are maybe a little more advanced, I'll try to give you something as well. So again, as a legislative body, it applies to the governing body, in this case the city council. It applies to you as subsidiary bodies, that's as TransCirc. It applies to Design Review Commission, Planning Commission, a whole host of the commissions that the council has created. It also applies to private bodies or other entities that are created by the city council or that they receive funds and a designated member from a legislative body. So that doesn't come up as frequently, but it's not just what I'll call the traditional commissions that the council has created. So we talked about the noticing requirements for a meeting. What is a meeting? A meeting is a majority of, in your case, your commission. So you're a 7-member commission. That means 4 of you gathering to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on an item that is within your subject matter jurisdiction. So it's not just taking action. Sometimes I'll hear people say, well, we didn't take any action on them, we just discussed the issue. That would be still subject to the Brown Act. And when I say a majority of your commission, I know at times you've had some vacancies, which is typical with other commissions, so sometimes I'll get questions, well, right now we have 2 vacancies, you're a 7-member commission, we have 2 vacancies, so we only have 5 people on the commission. Does that mean quorum is really 3? And I would say, no, quorum is always the majority of the full commission, so in your case it'll always be 4 if you are a 7-member, unless the council changes the number of commissioners, which happens occasionally. So as long as you're a 7-member commission, even if you have vacancies, the quorum will always be 4, and a meeting will always be 4 of you. So I think you're probably all aware this is a meeting, you're all physically in the same room to hear me talk about these various issues. But a lot of times, and much more recently, we have what are called serial meetings. That means you're not in the same room, you're using some electronic device, whether it be a phone, whether it be email, text, and you have correspondence going back and forth between commissioners. That creates what we call a serial meeting that can also be subject to the Brown Act. And there's two examples, chain and hub, that we'll go through that are, yeah, please.
Back to gathering majority. If let's say we have a board of 7, for example, or bad number, but if someone recuses themselves on an issue, does that adjust then the number for a majority?
You would still need 4 to hear the matter. So it may change how many you need to actually approve or make a recommendation on the matter. But if you have, let's say, 4 members sitting there and one of the individuals says, I have a conflict and I need to recuse myself because I live very close proximity, and they get up and they leave, then you don't have a quorum to hear the matter.
Okay.
So,
with clarification, now the other night, did we have 4 without me?
We did.
Was it 3 without me? Was it 4 without me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. But did you say if the person is still in the room,
No.
then they can decide on 3, or doesn't matter?
No,
Okay.
it's just if you're not, I mean, so if there, sometimes you'll have people who listen to the item and they abstain, but they're sitting on the dais because they don't actually have a conflict, but they may choose to abstain for a variety of reasons, then they would be counted towards the quorum. But in an example, I know you had, I think, a conflict because you lived in close proximity to one of the issues, and you announced it, recused yourself. And if you get up off of the dais, and even if you're sitting in the audience, you then only have however many people are sitting on the dais.
Thank you.
Okay. Can I ask another question about that one? It's not quite this. But can I still speak to the issue from
As a public
the
person.
audience, which is what I did the other night? It was very simple. I don't think we have to worry about a lawsuit over a speed bump.
So to the extent that it
As a
affects you
private
personally
citizen.
as a private citizen,
Yeah.
yes, you can speak to the matter in your
I
private
didn't have an
capacity.
opinion one way or the other particularly, but still I had some input to give.
Right, and so you could speak to the commission again as a private citizen
Okay. yeah.
during public
Mike was
comment
right.
portion. Okay, so these serial meetings that are where I would call the inadvertent violations occur, as opposed to, I think most people really get, there's 4 of us in the room, we shouldn't be talking about something. I mean, that still, believe me, it still happens, and we need to correct that. But I think where it happens more frequently is using electronic devices or calling each other. So there's the chain example. In your case, I should have added a D, because again, 4 is the quorum. Usually it's 3, but because we usually have 5-member bodies. But in your case, imagine Commissioner A starts talking to Commissioner B, B starts talking to C about an item that's before you, C talks to D, and you have 4 members now through serial communications, whether it be email, text, phone, who are communicating and hearing about an item that might be before you. The hub and spoke example can occur where Commissioner X ends up individually talking to 3 other commissioners about something that is before you or could be before you. And that would also cause a Brown Act violation. So this could occur, again, through email, where someone sends an email to, let's say a commissioner sends an email to all of the commissioners saying something that is pertinent to the commission. It can also happen if staff sends an email. We like to encourage when staff sends emails, to blind copy so that there's not a reply all, because sometimes you can accidentally reply to staff on something, and then if you reply all and it wasn't a blind copy, everyone on the commission gets it, and we could have a violation of the Brown Act. Just depends what's said. So if there's something you want to convey, let's say you read an article in the East Bay Times, you think the rest of the commission should see it. My suggestion is send it to staff. Staff can send it out to the rest of the commission, making sure that we're not causing a Brown Act violation. But if you start sending things on your own, there could be, even if it's an article, the East Bay Times article example wouldn't be a Brown Act violation. The problem is you may feel a little more confident and start sending other emails about other issues that could create a violation. So we like to have it filtered through staff to avoid that scenario.
Question on that one. And I'm baffled over this. I send, with regard to a lot of these bills that come out through Sacramento, or where.
Right, the various
Yeah,
housing bills. I've seen the emails.
the proposed. And so I will send maybe 200-300.
Right, you send up like an email blast,
And I send
right?
some to you so you
I
can
get
see
them too.
how, yeah. Well, I do that deliberately so
Right.
you maybe will tell me if I'm doing
And
something
I
wrong.
will if I there's an issue.
But anyway, is that, but these are building.
Yes.
Most of them that bother me are about things that add more traffic, more congestion.
Right, and I've seen your emails, and they're typically like, this housing bill is coming, and it's going to be heard by this committee, right, is the examples I've seen. So if you want your voice heard, let them know.
Yeah. Although sometimes I do say it's going to affect, it'll cause gridlock, which can do a chain reaction, and then I list some of those effects. Can that come back and bite us when we are processing a development?
Let's go, we're going to talk about in the next discussion on due process issues.
Okay.
So I'll bring back your example and touch on it a little further on. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about when the Brown Act applies. There's a lot of exceptions to the Brown Act when it doesn't apply. So contacts from the public, you know, if you go back to that example where I had the commissioner talking to A, B, and C, instead of it being a commissioner, if it was a member of the public who wanted to talk to you all individually, that's not a Brown Act violation. Any member of the public can talk to a quorum of you individually about whatever issues they may have that are related to the commission. However, I would suggest in general, when people are talking to you, to take the input in and not necessarily give your feedback, particularly if it relates to a land use project, back. And again, we'll talk about this in the next section on due process. But I would also suggest that if you do give your comments on something, that you remind them not to relay it to other commissioners to the extent that they're talking to other commissioners. It doesn't apply if you attend a conference that's open to the public, such as the League of California Cities Conference. Again, that assumes that you're not going to sit at lunchtime all together and then start talking about Lafayette projects. So if you're just sitting as part of the conference and part of that as an attendee, then it's fine. Any other open and publicized meeting of another agency, even if a majority of you sit there, again, if you're not sitting privately talking, is also not subject to the Brown Act. Any other government agency, as mentioned, like a county, or even if you're all sitting at an Orinda meeting or Moronga meeting, if it's a social occasion, let's say you attend a retirement party for a staff member, that's also not subject to the Brown Act. And then ad hoc committees are not subject to the Brown Act. Ad hoc means it's less than a quorum of your commission. So in this scenario, it would have to be 3 members or less, and it has to be solely made up of commissioners. So you can't say, well, we have 3 members of the commission, and then we're going to add someone from planning commission, and we're going to create an ad hoc committee just to look at speed humps in the city. That would then become subject to the Brown Act. But if it was just 3 commissioners looking at that finite issue, then it would be considered an ad hoc committee. It would not be subject to the Brown Act. Sometimes these ad hoc committees can go on, and at a certain point I'll say, it doesn't seem like it's a finite subject matter. We need to convert it from an ad hoc committee to what we call a standing committee that is subject to the Brown Act.
Sorry. You're not saying, however, back to that diagram that you had,
Mm-hmm.
you're not saying that one commissioner can't talk to another commissioner on a subject.
No, the limit for you is going to be you can't talk to more than 2 other commissioners on a subject. Because
Once you get to
four
fours.
members, including yourself, creates the quorum issue.
Yeah.
So
Just
if
wanted
you
to
do want to,
clarify that.
if you do want to chat to other commissioners, you just got to be careful and know, that you got to pick your 2 that you want to chat with.
What do you mean by careful? You can
Well,
only
just
have 2?
don't-
Yeah, you can't do more than 2. Because if you talk to 3 other commissioners, then that's 4 commissioners
Oh, yes,
talking
okay.
about something that's out of the public's purview.
So in the chain example, somebody sends an email to somebody who sends an email to somebody who sends an email to somebody, that could be over a week.
Yeah.
Is that's still a
It doesn't,
meeting
yeah,
by definition?
exactly. Right.
Okay, so it's a
It's a serial
conversation.
meeting. It's a conversation that's happening over time through electronic device. Yeah,
As long as it touches 4 people, then you got a
exactly.
problem.
That's
In
what
other words, you're not supposed to try to build a quorum in your own commission for the side that you prefer.
Okay.
So, again, in terms of the Brown Act, you can't talk about an item that's not on the agenda. So we're very clearly in this example talked about this is our agenda item. But there are times when you can add items to the agenda. It happens very rarely. If something came to the commission's attention after the agenda was posted and you need to take action before your next meeting, you can make a finding, and if there's a 2/3 vote, you can add it to the agenda. But it has to truly be something that didn't come to your attention. So the example I give is if there was a grant opportunity that we should have known about, but for some reason we didn't know about, that wouldn't be a good use of adding it to the agenda. You can always add emergency items to the agenda, and if it's something that was on your agenda and you're going to continue the meeting within 5 days, you don't need to renotice or agendize that. You can always, as we talked about, the public gets to speak during both generic public comment and comment on an agenda item. You can always give brief responses or statements back to the public. You can ask staff to clarify anything that the public has said. And you can always give a brief report on your item, things that you've been involved in. Sometimes that shows up as an agenda item, and even if it's not on the agenda, you can say, I attended these meetings, or I've been following these bills over the last month. You can always ask for staff to come back at a future meeting and just give you information on an item, or you could ask staff to give a brief response or information on an item. There are things that happen at meetings that are done in this open setting where everyone can attend, and there's something called closed session where the agenda item is on the agenda, but members of the public are not allowed to attend that portion of the meeting. This is typically not something that's going to happen for Transcirc, but you might notice it on city council meetings. The three examples I give, there's a long list of items that can be considered in closed session, but the three that I've listed are the ones that you might see more commonly on a council member's agenda. When there's litigation, whether it be existing litigation or a threat of litigation, the council can speak to that and discuss that in closed session without the public there. Council's interested in purchasing or selling property, it can talk about the price in terms of payment in closed session so that the buyer or the seller doesn't know how much the city is interested in purchasing or selling the property for. And then the other common item that and you may even be noticing it more frequently now on the agenda since the city's in the process of hiring a new city manager, is personnel issues. So you'll see interviews or appointment or consideration of a city manager. Likewise, if there's evaluation of employees, that shows up on the closed session agenda.
Yeah, question. When a staff person is writing a report to the city council and they're describing a project, Tony used to drive me wild with this because I used to go over a lot of the Bechtel contracts, and Tony would put down the estimated cost of the project. That immediately tells the builder, I can go that high. You know, all he has to do is read it, and that's your.
I think that is maybe more of a my issue.
Do
So-
you have to do that?
Yes, I mean, well, first of all, we have to have an estimate if we're asking for funding or if we're trying to budget for a project. Second of all, when we put a bid out, a public bid, we have to have an engineer's estimate,
Oh,
okay?
okay.
And it has to be
Isn't
fair.
that too bad?
That's public contract code in California.
Okay.
And we have to accept the low bidder, provided there is no reason to disqualify them,
Yeah.
okay? So
There's
that's
no
just
way to
part of code.
confidentially put that information out. I think
Okay.
that's probably where you're
Yeah,
going.
yeah.
I mean, the
Yeah.
contractor is not allowed to load their bid or to, they're not supposed to highly underbid or overbid. They're supposed to put a fair price down for each bid item. And we're not allowed to say, this is a $900,000 project, but we're gonna just estimate 700,000 because we think some
Someone will
estimator will just
700.
pick our number and put it in there. We're not allowed to do that. We have to actually bid or estimate the projects ourselves.
And they oftentimes come in much over estimate.
They often come in over.
Yeah.
15 years ago, they used to come in under. It's been a tough run.
Thank you.
So if there is a violation of the Brown Act, we always get an opportunity to cure. It's a redo. So if something was discussed at a meeting and it wasn't agendized, we can just hold another meeting and redo that discussion. We can, in the event that redo or we didn't find that we violated the Brown Act occurs, we end up getting sued. If the suit is not in our favor, the court can award attorney's fees to the other party. And then in addition, it can be found if there is a violation to be a misdemeanor. That's all I have for the Brown Act. So if there's no other questions, I'll move on to the next discussion. Sound good? Okay. The next discussion is about due process issues, and I know there were some questions in the Brown Act discussion that we'll bring up as part of this. And your role as commissioners to be impartial, attentive, and non-involved reviewers, and make reasonable, equitable, and careful decisions. So the type of decisions you make, whether they be recommendations or not, courts will often quote to commissioners about statements that you made at public meetings. So in what we'll call quasi-judicial decisions, these are decisions where you act as a judge, where you have typically a land use application, and the land use applicant is requesting some sort of permit or approval, and you are reviewing it against our codes. That would be what we call a quasi-judicial decision. A legislative decision, an example of that would be if the city's considering a general plan amendment, a zoning code, so it's a broad decision that's going to apply across the board to many property owners. And when you're in that judge capacity, that's the land use application capacity, you're sitting in this judicial process, and it requires a fair hearing. You have to be impartial and a non-involved reviewer. So in that setting, you cannot predetermine what you think of the application. In the general plan example, you could already have a thought that you would like to see, make sure that we have a roundabout in this location, or that we have a certain traffic pattern in this location, but not in a quasi-judicial setting. So to that extent, the real goal is that you listen to the evidence that is presented to you at the public meeting. And that's the information, along with the staff report and analysis, that you take into consideration. So should you have meetings with members of the public, we call these ex-parte communications, and you have them in advance of the meeting, you should disclose those conversations. And you should not just say, I met with this individual, you should say what you discussed. And the point is, the applicant needs to know what you're considering when you're making that decision. And if you considered something that was inaccurate, then the applicant would have the opportunity to provide you with the corrected information. But if you don't disclose that and base your decision on it, the applicant didn't have the fair opportunity to discuss that with you. And that's true when you go and visit the site. So I don't know, do you guys often go out and visit the site in advance? Yeah.
I did for the speed bump the other day.
Right,
Was that-
it's pretty common, and I think it's a good thing, to be honest. It's a good due diligence to go out and look at the site, but then you should disclose, before the meeting, I had an opportunity to go out to see the site. And that happened recently at a council meeting, and in that example, the story poles had been removed. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. So multiple people said, I went out, I think there was some council members, and depending when they went out, the story poles had already been taken down, and if they had gone out earlier, the story poles were there. And so they felt that they could not really get a real picture of the scale of the project.
What's a story?
The story poles are like, they're poles that really show the height of the project.
Oh, okay.
And they're placed where,
Right.
in
Sometimes
location.
they have flags on it.
They outline the roof line, so you can see
Exactly.
how
Yeah,
high
yeah,
it will be.
And so in that example, the applicant was able to say, well, the story poles were up, they were up through this time frame. Someone vandalized them and took them down. So then it was clear it wasn't the applicant who took them down, and the applicant was able to repost the story poles. We continued the meeting so that the council members who didn't have a chance to see it had an opportunity. And so that was a good example of them explaining what they did or didn't see and their concerns. So again, I think it is best to make these disclosures up front. I would suggest either doing it after staff has given their presentation, or you could even do it before staff gives their presentation. I wouldn't wait till the very end to do it, because you want the applicant to hear what you saw or heard when you went out there outside of the public hearing process. So bias. In order for an applicant to prevail on a bias claim, they have to show that there's an unacceptable probability of bias on the people, by the people or the individuals who make the decision. And it has to be established with concrete facts. So this could be established with emails. It could be established based off of comments off of websites. It could be established by, quotes that you may or may not have made in a newspaper, or statements you made to other individuals. So this goes to, I'm going to start to give you examples of cases where this has happened so you can get a feel or a flavor for it. And I mentioned this, the statements that you make at the public hearing, they show up in the minutes. If we get sued, the court looks at them, and we've had really great examples where the court has looked at the numerous statements and said there is substantial evidence in the record to support the decision. And it could be, even though a lot of times things get appealed to the council and the council ends up hearing the matter, the courts have quoted back to the commissions who have heard the matter. So they've quoted back to the various commissions, even though the end deciding body was the council. So I just want you to be very aware that your statements really do matter, and to think of that when you make them. So in this case, this is not our council. This was a lawsuit that didn't involve the city. It was a denial of a subdivision, and the council member in that case said, I'm kind of fishing around for a good legal reason to deny it, but so far I haven't found it. Then the court went on to state that although the record discloses no reason, the council member later voted to deny the subdivision request. The city council based its decision on the sole ground that it was the apparent desire of the majority of the people in Shorecliffs to disallow the re-subdivision request. So in this example, there was no evidence to support the denial other than members of the public saying, we don't want this subdivision. So in this Nasha case, this was the city of Los Angeles, and there's two cases that come back to back right in the city of LA that were not good for the city. Good for us in being able to explain fact patterns to you. This was a bias case, and it was a planning commissioner who had authored a article that attacked the project that was before the planning commission. It was in a homeowners association newsletter, and he didn't even, I don't know how it actually came out, because it wasn't like the author was listed on the article, but somehow they figured out that he was the author of this article. And it had come out, and it was still under consideration by the planning commission he sat on. To make things worse, instead of it being a unanimous decision, it was, let's say, a 4-3 decision against the project, so he was on the deciding vote, and the court unwound the decision. And they stated he clearly should have recused himself from hearing the matter. His participation in the appeal to the planning commission requires the commission's decision be vacated. So they ended up unwinding that whole decision.
So excuse me. So if you don't like something, and that's a bias then, like if you don't like speed bumps, you're always going to be against speed bumps.
That's a good question, yeah.
Yeah,
So general dislike.
And I don't know how it came up if you have a general dislike for speed bumps, and let's say there's is it come up as typically a staff is recommending us, or is it the neighborhood who recommends it? I don't know how
The neighborhood will request
a speed bump.
a speed bump. Staff will look at it and see if we would even agree with trying it. And then it typically would become before the Transportation Circulation Commission. That's a good example of a standard traffic calming request.
And if you don't like speed bumps, then we should recuse.
You know, in that example, the speed bump is being placed on our property, I presume.
Public right of way.
It's a public right of way, so it wouldn't be, I would say, that quasi judicial decision, right? It's our property to decide if we want to put speed bumps. And I mean, absent a no speed bump policy, you may just want to be, I don't prefer speed bumps, but there could be scenarios, presumably, that may warrant one. But in that example, it wouldn't rise to that same level of a predetermination.
Well, I'm trying to figure out whether a bias is a dislike or liking. Is that personal liking?
It is. I mean, it's predetermining in a land use application context. It's before you actually get to the hearing saying, I don't like this project, I'm against it, I don't like X, Y, and Z, instead of keeping that open mind. Because at the public hearing, you can listen to all the evidence and then you can give your opinion.
Okay.
So there's a time and place to give your opinion, but it shouldn't be before the public hearing.
That gets back to the emails that I send out. And it's pretty obvious that I don't like a lot of growth that is going to jam and gridlock our roads. But when we get down to a specific project, that's another matter in my head.
Right.
But I don't know whether the public would see it that way, or
Well,
developer.
And it depends how you phrase the email, because each of these cases is very fact specific, and they'll look at the fact pattern. So if your email, it talks about a legislative bill, and then at the end of it, you start talking about disliking certain things, which, well, you may not reference a project, seem to be all tied to a particular project, you could see how that would cause,
But if it's
potentially
just
cause a problem.
Too much, an emphasis on too much growth in general.
In general.
And then you get a specific project, and
Then the
I
question
wouldn't
will be,
have-
are you open
Yeah.
to having some growth, or have you said too much about how you don't want any growth? I'm making this up.
Yeah, no.
You don't want any growth in a particular area. So if you've gotten so far as to say, I don't want any growth in a particular area, and I'd be absolutely against that, and then this project is in that area, you can see where you may not be a neutral decision maker.
I don't have that problem. I
So-
think.
In this example, in Newport Beach, Hen was a council member and he had appealed a decision of the Planning Commission to the council, heard? And so this was, I think, a pretty embarrassing situation for the city of LA, in which they had to redo it and actually pay attention. One other example I want to give for bias that can create an appearance of bias is when you encourage people to come to a meeting. So I think you have to be very careful if you are saying, hey, we have this whatever land use application on our agenda tonight, please come. And the way you phrase it could be interpreted by applicants as maybe you're not in favor of that project, and that's why you want a mass of people to come and speak against the project. So I just want to caution you, particularly feel like we're in a new era where applicants are very conscious of these decisions and these issues and wanting to make sure that they get the fair hearing. And I don't want any accusations made, whether accurate or not, that we're biased. Let's put it that way.
If they have a city council member who, say, is president of a homeowners association, is that a conflict of interest automatically?
No, I mean, I think in that planning commission example, the NASHA example, it wasn't that he was just on, like, let's say president or a member of the homeowners association. So let's say your homeowners association takes a position on a project. As long as you weren't involved in that position, right, that you weren't voting on, I can't say I know exactly how all these associations work, but let's say you're on a board that decides to vote to take a position on the project, you shouldn't be on that board taking that position. So you can leave
at that point.
Yeah, you should say, I'm going to recuse myself, I'm on the commission, for due process reasons, I'm not going to participate. But just being a member of the homeowners association isn't going to create the conflict. It's the predetermination, it's the article that he wrote or voting on how the association feels about the project that's going to cause the conflict. So again, it needs to,
question. But if you're a commissioner and your commission isn't involved with a city project, let's say the homeowners council board, for example, that I've been a member of for 35 years, something like that. And if they want to take a position against a project, which I think we've only done that once, but anyway, is that something, if it's not coming before the circulation commission, would I be able to vote on something like that? If it's not before your own body?
In theory, yes. My only hesitancy is sometimes things get referred back. So maybe something doesn't hit you as a commission, but I've seen sometimes the council will say, what does TransServe think about this?
Yeah.
And so it was never supposed to come to you, and then all of a sudden later in the process.
Then you have to.
Yeah, so I would just, that would be the risk, that you thought it was never going to come to you, so you took a position and then somehow it gets referred back to you, then you might have to recuse yourself, depending on what you said. But if it was never going to come to you, then it wouldn't be a problem. Because you're not a decision maker, right?
Yeah, right. Another question, I don't know if this fits in here at all or not, but there have been times when someone will apply for a board position and they've been a member of a group that sued the city. And I always say, no, nobody who sued the city, please.
Oh, but that's for like they want to be a member of the
homeless council board. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that necessarily other people don't establish them and vote them in. But wouldn't that be a conflict of interest?
I couldn't speak. I mean, I don't do HOA.
So it's hard to know.
I mean, it would be a city issue. Let's put it that way.
All right.
Right. It's an issue for the HOA.
Yeah.
Not for
except that the city, but the HOA then presents materials to the city.
They can, but anyone can present materials to the city.
Oh, okay.
So it wouldn't be a conflict
It's not
because those people aren't on a commission or a council or staff members.
So only okay.
Right.
Thank you.
So the takeaways: how to avoid even the appearance of bias. Avoid statements prior to the close of hearing that suggest that your mind is made up. We talked about that in great detail, right? You can tell us what you think, but close the public hearing. Then there's the part where it comes back to the commission for discussion. That's the time to disclose your thoughts. Don't pre-commit to decisions. if you think you can't be fair, or if you've said or done something, come chat with me, and we can decide if you should participate or not. And then if you do talk to people outside of the public hearing process, disclose that, disclose what you talked about, and that includes site visits. We're gonna get to the very tail end, we're almost done. Any other questions on the?
Yeah, if you go visit a site, you have to disclose it.
Yeah, if you go, you know, in advance of the meeting, let's say that was the example I gave where the council members went to visit a site, and they depending when they visited, someone had taken down the story poles. So that's the example where you just go and you say, you know, this afternoon I went to visit the site before the meeting and, you know, just checked it out. Because then the applicant can tell you, you know what, we did something to the site just today that isn't representative of how the site really is. That's the point, to give them an opportunity to correct something that may not be really how the application is.
Yeah, question. Peripherally involved, I guess. Periodically, we get questions from residents who want to know how to appeal a decision, say, for example, that the Planning Commission would have made. And I always say, you know, you can appeal and talk to the city, and if you can get a city council member to appeal for you, you won't have to pay the price because it's expensive. What's the cost, by the way, now?
I don't know what the cost is. It's typically a percentage of the application.
Okay, anyway.
So that just shifts the burden, unfortunately, to the city.
Yeah, okay. So beyond that,
So I typically, you
what
know,
then?
they pay. They have to pay the application costs because there are real
but
costs.
who would they see to process
Oh,
an
the appeal?
And then they would see a council member if they wanted the council member to appeal, I presume.
Right,
But
and then
then
they
how would they appeal to say if they wanted in
to
some
do it
other way?
themselves.
Mhm.
Yeah, then they would just ask staff. There's the procedures laid out. I think we have even something on the website. It's in our municipal code. There's application forms. So
It's just the planner that's assigned to that project would be the person to talk to, and they would
yeah,
let them know the process, the cost,
Yeah.
the timing.
my suggestion is just to refer them to that planner, and they can give them the details on the appeal process.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. All right.
Okay, so now we're at the tail end. Conditions of approval. So conditions of approval are placed on a project. Typically, staff has already got a long list of conditions. Some of them are standard conditions that they put on most projects. Some of them are very specific to the individual project at hand. And there's different authority for those conditions. Sometimes it's from ordinances that we have in place, or general plan, environmental documents. So it can come, the reason for the condition can come up in a variety of different ways. So the real issue I want to chat with you about with conditions of approval is if the commission wants to impose a condition of approval, there needs to be a relationship between the impact that the project creates and the condition that you are imposing, right? That's what we call nexus. And then in addition to the nexus that has to be there has to be a proportionality between what you are imposing versus the impact that is created. And so I'm going to give you two examples. One is we call this the Nolan-Dolan test because there's two cases. The Nolan case is a California case where it was out of Ventura County, where a property owner, there was a dilapidated building that was on the beach, and they wanted to demolish the dilapidated building and put up a 3-bedroom bungalow that they felt was in keeping with the rest of the property. And the Coastal Commission in that case said, we're going to impose a condition of approval, and we're going to put in an access easement, a beach access easement for the public, because they felt that having that home there was going to impede the visual, the public's visual ability to view the beach. But they imposed trail easement so that people could physically access the beach. You can see me emphasizing certain words, right? The impact was visual, but they imposed a physical access easement as the condition of approval. And the court in that case said, where is the nexus? If the impact is visual, why didn't you have setbacks so that, you know, on different parts of the property you could still see the beach? Maybe you would have height limitations. That would address the visual nature. You didn't need to take an easement on this property to give access when access wasn't the issue. So that's an example of nexus. And then in the second example, the Dolan case, this is out of Oregon, it was a situation where there was nexus, but the proportionality of the condition was too big. So in that case, it was, they were trying to enlarge a plumbing store. And as part of the approval, they were going to enlarge the plumbing store and they were going to repave the parking lot that was right there. So the city had, it was a building permit, and the city had imposed a condition of approval that took some sort of, I don't know, easement over within a certain area over the 100-year floodplain. And then they also got a bike path as a sort of like trail easement, because they felt that would relieve trips, circulation trips, the bike path. And the court said, okay, we get that there may be drainage issues, which is why you didn't want building in the floodplain, but you didn't need to take the land. It ended up being between the two easements, it was 10% of the property. And so the court said, this is too much. You didn't need to actually say, take an easement over the area within the 100-year floodplain. You could have said no development within the floodplain, you could have had setbacks, and then with regard to the bike path, you didn't show how this was really going to take trips off of people going to a plumbing store. And I think in one part of the case, they talked about someone really going to bike to a plumbing store and put a toilet on the back of their bike. It's not really, you're not showing how this is really going to impact circulation and trips. If you had more evidence, that would be helpful. So maybe to put it in terms of something you guys might see, let's say you have a project that's before you and you're thinking, hey, we need a signal here. This has always been a great location for a signal. So in terms of nexus, you have to ask yourself, is this project, or the impacts of this project creating the need for the signal? If the answer is no, you shouldn't be asking as a condition of approval for a signal. If the answer is yes, that staff can demonstrate that this project warrants a signal, the next question is, does it warrant payment for the entirety of the signal? Because oftentimes a project won't be large enough to warrant the entirety of the signal. So you may have a scenario where it warrants maybe only a third of the signal. So then really the condition of approval is that they should pay for a third of the signal. And then as projects develop, either the city confront it if they want the signal so bad, or the other projects that come in pay their fair share of the signal. But you wouldn't ask for 100% of that signal if that project didn't warrant it. That would be an example of the proportionality problem.
Question. We had a situation on Mount Diablo Boulevard where a flasher was desired just for crossing. And
Those pedestrian lights.
yeah. And they got expensive. You wouldn't think they would be. They're cheaper than a signal.
All this stuff is pretty expensive, right? Which is why I wanted to bring this exact issue up.
Yeah, but the project that we had in mind to at least provide maybe 50,000, or part of it anyway, is taking a long time. And we'd like to get that in sooner. Now, is it possible to say, well, we have X number of projects probably coming in around here. We could almost imagine 3 or 4, or maybe 2 or whatever. And a certain percentage we want to pay for some of these facilities. And but they're not built yet, and maybe they haven't even applied yet.
Right.
So is it possible for us to pay, but then have some sort of a designation whereby there is going to be a nexus with all these people that are going to be coming, and we want some of that money back again from these developments?
That was kind of the example I was giving.
Can we do that?
You can. I think the real question is that you want to make sure that the other projects, when they come forward, or if they come, 2 issues. Those projects may never come forward. So if the city fronts, a $50,000 pedestrian signal, and that may not be as big of an issue as a light, which I know is like more in the $250,000 range. Is if those projects don't come forward, then the city ends up on the hook for paying it.
Yeah.
Right. And if the projects do end up coming forward, and we say 10% is attributed to you, 20% is attributed to you, you really want to make sure you can show that, because if you installed it in advance, you don't want it to look like we just really wanted the signal or the pedestrian crossing, and there wasn't a nexus to the project. But if we know we can show that X amount of projects are going to create the need for this pedestrian crossing, but we just personally want it sooner, then you could do that, again, with the risk that you may not be getting the funding because those projects may never materialize.
Yeah, or taking that risk.
Right.
But if you can show that it's going to be worse, obviously it's needed now.
See, that's going to be,
That's the
that's the problem.
That's
If
the
you
problem.
say it's needed now,
But
but
not
those
severely
projects.
needed right
Right.
now.
So then that gets to the proportionality, right? So then it's like, maybe it's only, the current situation would only justify part of this signal, but these next projects are gonna be the ones that trip the
That's-
requirement,
Yeah.
right? So so you'd wanna be very clear when you decided to fund it up front that it's not needed now,
Not
without
as
future
much.
projects,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Or
'Cause
so
then,
maybe by that time we'll get into a full signal.
Right.
We were hoping to avoid the full signal.
right, because the fear then is that then they'll argue that you needed it before our project came about, we didn't create the impact. So that's the only thing, you want to make sure the record is clear that it wasn't needed up front before the project came forward.
Or could you put one in, put a signal in, and then have everybody pay for it, that it's not needed yet, and then have all the different developments that are coming along pay for that signal.
Presuming again that their development creates the need.
Oh boy, it will.
It's all about the documentation you can show.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
That's all I
terrific.
have for you guys.
That's great.
Thank you.
Does anybody have questions for Mala? Any examples, anything else?
How do you spell your name?
It's Mala Subramanian.
No, your first name, but I can't read.
Oh, sorry, it's Mala.
Oh. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for presenting and helping. We may call on you again later on. Well, we don't know when. In particular, there's one development that the terraces will be coming back, and we may need some guidance in terms of how we can be looking at old materials, ahead of new hearings, and how if stuff's in the public record, we be reading that, and will that affect our decision making going forward? So that will be something I think we'll deal with when we need to.
Okay.
But thanks so much. Anybody
Well,
else?
I have one question,
Sure.
that's a little goofy, but if I were to tell Mike about the speed bump, or the example of a speed bump somewhere, do I have to tell the other commissioners at the same time, or I can just tell Mike about it?
In the example, what would you end up telling Mike? What would be?
That there are some rubber type speed bumps.
That are better than
That are better
others.
than others?
Yes.
You're saying like this type of speed bump is you
Right.
should consider it. No, I would, in that scenario, I would only tell Mike, or you could tell 2 other commissioners max. Right, because that would be less than a quorum.
All right.
But, if the city is thinking of doing speed bumps, I think at a minimum it makes sense to tell Mike, because then he can consider it.
Right. yeah.
So we've had some questions on this with this, and my recommendation is if you're telling something to staff, if there's not an urgency to it, you guys, typically you have a comment time or a sharing time.
At the end of all.
And I think
Right.
that's the most appropriate time when it is a noticed, we had a couple good examples, I think, at our last meeting. Stella, you had a picture of what they did in San Francisco, for example.
Right.
When a pedestrian was hitting a crosswalk, and
Okay.
That is a good
you had
time
the
to share
toilet
it.
plungers right across the road or whatever. I mean, so
Excellent.
rather than just pre-send that out to your fellow commissioners, that was a super appropriate place to show it. We were actually able to get visuals on it, and that's kind of
Yeah.
neat too.
And then if there wants to be, if you want to have a more detailed discussion other than a brief discussion about it,
You can
then you
agendize
just you can say, I saw this, I want to show it to you all, I would like to have it agendized for a future meeting,
Very
so we
good.
can talk about it.
That's
I understand.
probably the best route, or the cleanest. There's no question, right? That you're only talking about it at the agendized meeting.
Yes.
And then you're not taking action on it that night. It's kind of show and tell, if you will.
Right.
And then it could come as
Excellent.
or it could be just for information, or it could be, we want to agendize this and talk about this because we think it would apply to this location in Lafayette.
Or just agendize it anyway.
Or you can always request staff to agendize it,
Yeah.
and that's fine too. And then you could take action or speak on it, or the public could comment on it if they were
Because
interested. in
otherwise
it.
you're just stuck giving your brief comment on it, so,
Yeah.
which may be fine, which is all you may want, but if you want a larger, robust discussion, then you should agendize it.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, nothing else? Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.